On Saturday, January 17th, 2026, thousands gathered at San Francisco's Civic Center Plaza to honor Bob Weir, the Grateful Dead co-founder who had passed away just 1 week earlier. It was supposed to be a sacred moment. John Mayer playing acoustic guitar, Mickey Hart sharing memories, Joan Baez remembering Bob's barefoot dancing. But then Nancy Pelosi took the stage in a bright magenta suit, held up a vote sign, and swayed along to Ripple as social media exploded with criticism. Is Nancy Pelosi drunk at the Bob Weir homecoming? One user asked. Nancy Pelosi wearing a very somber magenta on stage at Bob Weir's funeral, another mocked. Within hours, the 85-year-old former House Speaker became the story, not for honoring a music legend, but for what critics called a tone-deaf, self-serving performance at a memorial. So what actually happened at that memorial? Was the criticism fair? And what does this reveal about politics, grief, and how we remember our heroes? Background context, 045L4. To understand the controversy, you need to understand three things: who Bob Weir was, who Nancy Pelosi is, and the unique relationship between the Grateful Dead and San Francisco politics. Bob Weir died on January 10th, 2026 at age 78 after battling cancer and ultimately succumbing to lung issues. He was a founding member of the Grateful Dead, the guitarist and vocalist who kept the band's music alive for 30 years with Jerry Garcia, and then for another 30 years after Garcia's death through various incarnations. The other ones, Rat Dog, Further, and finally Dead and Company. But Bob Weir wasn't just a musician. He was a San Francisco icon. San Francisco Mayor Daniel Lurie said Dead and Company's 3-day concert series last summer at Golden Gate Park was a homecoming for a band that helped shape the city and its soul. Variety. San Francisco and the Grateful Dead are inseparable, Lurie said. This is a city where they performed more than 320 concerts across 24 venues. Variety. Nancy Pelosi, 85, has represented San Francisco in Congress since 1987, nearly 40 years. She served as Speaker of the House twice, making her one of the most powerful politicians in American history. She announced in November 2025 that she would retire from Congress when her current term ends in 2027. She's also a self-proclaimed Deadhead, a devoted fan of the Grateful Dead. And here's where it gets interesting. The Grateful Dead and progressive Bay Area politics have always been intertwined. The band emerged from the 1960s counterculture, played free concerts in Golden Gate Park, and embodied San Francisco's values of community, creativity, and social justice. Politicians like Pelosi have long aligned themselves with the band's legacy because it connects them to the city's cultural identity. So when Bob Weir died, it made perfect sense that Nancy Pelosi would speak at his memorial. She was a longtime fan, a San Francisco representative, and someone who knew Weir personally. Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House, a longtime Bay Area politician and an outspoken Deadhead, noted Weir's efforts to preserve democracy and encourage voting. Bob Weir. But what happened at that memorial turned what should have been a simple tribute into a viral controversy. The memorial event for 7:30. Drawing an estimated crowd of around 25,000, the program came together in the days following Weir's passing on January 10th and was organized by promoters Another Planet and Live Nation. Rolling Stone. The memorial began with a 3-block procession down Market Street, with a hearse carrying Bob's body followed by a tour bus displaying the iconic Steal Your Face logo. At Civic Center Plaza, the program included Mickey Hart, the Grateful Dead drummer, and the most prominent surviving founding member who could attend. Joan Baez, the folk legend, spoke. John Mayer, who had played with Bob in Dead and Company for nearly a decade, delivered an emotional eulogy. Natasha Weir and her daughters Chloe and Monet shared heartfelt memories. Buddhist monks from the Gyuto Foundation offered healing prayers. And then Nancy Pelosi took the stage. Bobby Weir was not just a musician, a magician too. He was a force of nature, Pelosi said at one point. Media Mass Pelosi asked the crowd to shout out the title of their favorite Dead song before proclaiming, "My favorite Dead song is whatever Bobby Weir was singing at that moment." Variety. Nancy Pelosi did her best to tie Weir's efforts to her own, claiming that music, like democracy, is not fixed. "It is something we make together," she said. The world is a better place because of Bobby Weir. Bob Weir. But then came the moment that ignited the controversy. Pelosi also used the moment to deliver a political message, encouraging attendees to vote. Weir gave me this sign, and I'll show it today because I said Bobby really loved democracy. He loved our country, she said, before holding up a sign reading, "Vote." You know what he wanted everybody to do? Vote. Media mass. After her speech, Pelosi appeared to sing and sway along on stage as musician John Mayer performed the Grateful Dead classic, Ripple. Media mass. At the end of his eulogy, Mayer picked up an acoustic guitar and led the crowd in a sing-along version of the American Beauty classic, Ripple, a chorus comprised of Weir's close friends and family members, including Hart, Baez, Natasha, Chloe, and Monet, all took the stage to aid the guitarist in the moment. Rolling Stone Nancy Pelosi was part of that chorus, swaying and singing along with John Mayer and the Weir family. The social media backlash, 7:30.10. The response on social media was swift and brutal. Is Nancy Pelosi drunk at the Bob Weir homecoming? One user wrote on X, or in Yaron Fiat. Media mass. Nancy Pelosi wearing a very somber magenta on stage at Bob Weir's funeral. One user joked on X, TMZ, why is Nancy Pelosi speaking at this Bob Weir memorial? One user questioned on X, my bingo card today didn't include Nancy Pelosi singing Ripple along with John Mayer at the Bobby Weir send-off, another user wrote. Media mass. The criticism fell into several categories. First, her outfit. Others criticized Pelosi's bright magenta suit, a stark contrast from the black clothing worn by most others on stage at the event. Media mass? While Joan Baez, John Mayer, Mickey Hart, and most speakers wore black or dark colors, Pelosi wore bright magenta. To critics, this seemed attention-seeking and disrespectful at a memorial service. Second, her political message. Holding up a vote sign and encouraging voter participation at a memorial for a musician struck many as inappropriate and self-serving. Even if Bob Weir did care about democracy, and by all accounts he did, was his memorial the right place for a political message? Third, her demeanor. Video footage showed Pelosi swaying and moving to the music during Ripple. Some viewers questioned whether she was intoxicated. Others simply found her behavior inappropriate for a somber occasion. Fourth, her presence itself. Some users also questioned why Pelosi, who announced in November that she will retire from Congress when her current term ends in 2027, was included in the event in the first place. TMZ, why was a politician speaking at all? Shouldn't the memorial focus on musicians, family, and close friends? The backlash was amplified by conservative media outlets like Fox News and the New York Post, which ran stories highlighting the social media criticism. The controversy became less about Bob Weir's life and legacy and more about Nancy Pelosi's alleged misstep. Pelosi's defense and the full context, Noita Pretenikon, 12:30. But here's what gets lost in the viral clips and the outrage context. First, Nancy Pelosi was invited to speak. This wasn't her crashing the memorial or inserting herself where she didn't belong. The organizers, Another Planet and Live Nation, working with Bob Weir's management and family, asked her to participate. She was there because the people running the memorial wanted her there. Second, she wasn't the only politician who spoke. San Francisco Mayor Daniel Lurie offered a few words about the lifelong Bay Area resident, Bob Weir. But Lurie didn't face the same backlash, perhaps because he's newer to politics and spoke more briefly. Third, Bob Weir actually did care about democracy and voting. He was a longtime activist for environmental causes, animal rights, and social justice. He served as a United Nations Goodwill Ambassador. He encouraged civic engagement. Pelosi claiming that Bob loved democracy and wanted people to vote isn't inaccurate. It's just that memorials aren't typically where we deliver those messages. Fourth, about that magenta suit. The Grateful Dead weren't exactly known for somber black clothing. They wore tie-dye. They celebrated color and vibrancy. The entire aesthetic of the Dead was psychedelic and bright. While most speakers wore black as a sign of mourning, one could argue that Pelosi's bright magenta was actually more in keeping with the Dead's spirit. Joan Baez recalled that Weir was the only other person she knew who danced barefoot on stage. Bob Weir wasn't a conventional person, so why should his memorial be conventional? Fifth, Pelosi is 85 years old. When critics questioned whether she was drunk based on her swaying and movement, they might have been witnessing an elderly woman simply enjoying music that meant something to her. She's been a Deadhead for decades. Ripple is one of the Dead's most beloved songs. Is it really surprising or inappropriate that she would move to the music? Pelosi herself has not responded to the criticism. Nancy Pelosi could not be immediately reached for comment. Media mass, analysis, and 12:30, 14:30. So what actually happened here? And why did it become such a controversy? The reality is this was a clash between different grief cultures. Some people view memorials as solemn, quiet occasions focused entirely on the deceased. Others view them as celebrations of life where joy, music, and even political messages are appropriate. The Grateful Dead community has always leaned toward the latter. They sing at memorials, they celebrate. They don't do traditional mourning. But when you broadcast a memorial to millions on social media, you're inviting people who aren't part of that culture to judge it by their own standards. And by traditional memorial standards, Pelosi's performance was unusual. Second, this reveals the tension between politicians and authenticity. Nancy Pelosi has been in Congress for nearly 40 years. She's one of the most powerful people in American politics. When someone like that claims to be a deadhead, there's automatic skepticism. Is she really a fan, or is this political branding? Did she really know Bob Weir personally, or is she just attaching herself to a beloved figure for political benefit? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Pelosi likely is a genuine fan. You don't represent San Francisco for 40 years without developing some appreciation for the Grateful Dead. But she's also a politician who knows how to use cultural moments for political messaging. Third, this demonstrates how social media amplifies and distorts moments. A 30-second clip of Pelosi swaying to Ripple went viral, but the full context, that she was part of a chorus including Weir's wife, daughters, Mickey Hart, and Joan Baez, gets lost. The clip makes it look like she was the focus, when in reality she was just one of many people on stage. Fourth, age and gender likely play a role in the criticism. Would an 85-year-old male politician face the same scrutiny for his demeanor and outfit? Would people question whether he was drunk based on his movement? There's a particular harshness to how older women in public life are judged for their appearance and behavior. Finally, this reveals our broader cultural discomfort with politicians at cultural events. We want our political leaders to be human, to have interests beyond politics, to connect with the culture. But when they actually do that, we accuse them of being inauthentic or self-serving. It's a no-win situation. Bob Weir's actual legacy, 1430-16. The tragedy of this controversy is that it overshadowed what the memorial was actually about, celebrating Bob Weir's extraordinary life. Weir's wife Natasha and their daughters Chloe and Monet offered an emotional tribute, with Chloe a photographer who has documented her father and many other acts in concert proudly proclaiming that in 30 years, a 60-year-old fan will brag to someone in their 20s about seeing the Dead when Weir was in the band. Rolling Stone. At one point, Natasha also commented on a hawk flying over the crowd, which later appeared while the crowd sang Not Fade Away. Rolling Stone Mickey Hart said, Bob liked to talk about where the music would be in 300 years. After watching it all build for 60 years, he could envision the depth of our impact hundreds of years down the line. Bob Weir. His daughter Shala Weir called him a natural activist and avid advocate for the environment, animals, and human rights. Variety John Mayer delivered what many considered the most emotional speech of the afternoon. Mayer said that he and Weir were born on the same day, 30 years apart, and noted how the two learned to trust each other's intuitions despite their generational gap. Bob Weir. The memorial ended with 25,000 people singing Ripple together, a moment of communal grief and celebration that embodied everything the Grateful Dead stood for. But the next day, the headlines weren't about that beautiful moment. They were about Nancy Pelosi's magenta suit. Bigger lessons, 16 on 17 May. What can we learn from this controversy? First, social media rewards outrage over nuance. The full story of Bob Weir's memorial, the family tributes, the Buddhist prayers, the communal singing, is complex and moving. But complex and moving doesn't go viral. Nancy Pelosi acts drunk at memorial, goes viral. Second, we need to be more thoughtful about how we judge public grief. Different cultures mourn differently. The Grateful Dead community has its own traditions that might look strange to outsiders. Before we mock someone for how they grieve, we should consider whether our standards are the right ones to apply. Third, politicians will always struggle with authenticity. Nancy Pelosi's appearance at the memorial might have been completely genuine, a lifelong fan honoring a musician she loved. But because she's a politician, every gesture gets interpreted through a political lens. That's the price of public life. Fourth, maybe we should ask, what would Bob Weir have wanted? He was a man who spent his life breaking conventions, challenging norms, and bringing unlikely people together. Would he have been offended by Nancy Pelosi's magenta suit and vote sign, or would he have appreciated the spirit of it, even if the execution was clumsy? Conclusion 17-18. On January 17, 2026, thousands gathered in San Francisco to say goodbye to Bob Weir. It was supposed to be a celebration of a life spent making music, building community, and showing that creativity and consciousness can walk hand in hand. Nancy Pelosi spoke. She wore magenta. She held up a vote sign. She swayed to Ripple alongside John Mayer, Mickey Hart, Joan Baez, and the Weir family. And the internet decided she'd committed an unforgivable sin. Was her performance perfect? No. Was it tone-deaf to inject a political message into a memorial? Arguably, yes. Was the magenta suit a questionable choice? Maybe. But was it the scandal that social media made it out to be? Was it worth drowning out the beautiful tributes, the family memories, the communal singing that actually mattered? Absolutely not. We are living in a time when it feels like our world is turning upside down. Pelosi had said at the memorial, echoing words that others have spoken recently about grief and change. Media mass Bob Weir spent 60 years showing us that music brings people together across differences, that a community can form around shared love of art, that endings aren't final, just transitions to something else. The controversy over Nancy Pelosi's appearance shows us the opposite: how quickly we divide, how eagerly we judge, how easily we miss the point. 25,000 people sang Ripple together in San Francisco last Saturday. That's the story that matters. That's the legacy Bob Weir would want us to remember, not the magenta suit, not the vote sign, not the viral clips, just the music and the people it brought together. One more time. Fare thee well, Bobby, and maybe fare thee well to our need to turn every moment into a controversy.